There is a version of forgiveness that has been sold to trauma survivors for a really long time. And it goes something like this. If you do the work, if you go to therapy, if you pray enough, if you're spiritually mature enough, if you love enough, you will eventually get to a place where you can forgive the person who hurt you. And once you get there, you'll be healed. You'll be free. You'll be able to have that relationship again, and it will all be okay. And I want to say something very clearly about that version of forgiveness. It is a lie. Not always, but often enough that we need to talk about it because it conflates two things that are entirely separate: forgiving and reconciling. And forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. And for many of us with complex trauma histories, understanding the difference between them is one of the most important and most liberating realizations of our entire healing journey. So let's just dive into this conversation today.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
All right, everybody, welcome back. It is so good to be back this week to talk about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And we're going to be talking about these as two separate things because they are. You can pursue one without the other. And in many situations, reconciliation is not safe. It's not appropriate, and it's not required. And number two, when the apology never comes, the healing work shifts. It becomes more about what you do with the pain internally rather than waiting for someone external that may never arrive. And finally, number three, forgiving yourself for not protecting someone you love, for staying too long, for not seeing it coming. That is often the hardest and most important forgiveness work of all. And it is entirely separate from anything that the person who caused the harm does or does not do. So let's just dive right in. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper today into the personal thread that I introduced on Monday because I think that context matters, and because I think that there are people listening who have maybe experienced something similar and have never heard anyone in a clinical role say out loud what I am about to say. And if you tuned in last week, you heard a little bit about the context of this story, but about 10 years ago, something happened that changed our family, both my family of origin and my now family. It changed it permanently. And I'm going to keep this really vague because the details belong to my children, and it is not my story alone to tell. But I want you to understand the shape of it. And a child in my family was physically harmed by an adult. And this was someone connected to people that we trusted and in a context where we should have been safe. And the harm was real. The harm was very serious. And it marked all of us in ways that we are still 10 years later having to navigate. And then came the secondary injury. So the one that in many ways was just as damaging as the first. the people from my family of origin who I expected to stand beside us did not. And not only did they not show up the way that I needed them to, but they aligned with the side of the person who caused the harm. And I can speak firsthand that in a family system where accountability was never modeled, where apologies were never offered cleanly, where loyalty to appearances often outweighed loyalty to the truth, the response I got was confusion, minimizing, and abandonment at the moment that I and my family needed the support the most. And to this day, I still have never received the appropriate full apology for that. Not a real one anyway. Not the kind that Harriet Lerner describes, the kind that takes full responsibility without deflecting, without the word but, without making it about the feelings of the person apologizing. So not that kind of apology. And for a long time, I thought that meant that I could not heal, that I was stuck waiting for something that would allow me to finally move forward. And what I know now is that waiting for an apology that never comes as a precondition for your own healing is one of the most painful and most common traps that trauma survivors fall into. And getting out of that trap doesn't require forgiving anyone. I think it requires shifting the work from external to internal. And we're going to talk about how to do that today. So let's just jump into to takeaway one. Forgiving and reconciling are not the same thing. And this is the distinction that I wish someone had given me much earlier. And I wish it was taught more clearly and more consistently in clinical training, in religious communities, in the cultural conversation around healing. Forgiveness, in the way that Dr. Harriet Lerner frames it, is an internal process. It is what happens inside of you when you decide to release, at whatever percentage you're capable of, the consuming rage and resentment that is costing you energy and peace. It is not about the other person. It does not require their participation. It does not require contact with them. It does not mean what they did was okay. It does not mean you trust them. It does not mean you want them in your life. It is about you, your nervous system, your capacity to stop carrying the weight of what they did as an active consuming presence in your daily life. And reconciliation is something entirely different. Reconciliation is it's a relational process. It requires both people. It requires the person who caused harm to take genuine and full accountability, to offer a real apology, to demonstrate through changed behavior over time that they are safe. It requires rebuilding trust that was broken. And it is only appropriate when the conditions for safety actually exist. So how I take this is that you can do forgiveness work, whatever percentage of it you're capable of, without ever reconciling with the person who hurt you. You can find some measure of peace with what happened without ever having that person back in your life. And those are separate processes that don't require each other. And this matters enormously for trauma survivors because so much of the pressure around forgiveness, I think, is actually pressure towards reconciliation, towards restoring a relationship, getting the family back together. acting like it didn't happen, or at least like it doesn't still matter. And let me tell you, that kind of pressure, I can say firsthand, often comes from people who are more invested in their own comfort than in your actual healing. You are allowed to do your internal work without reopening the door to someone who has not demonstrated that they deserve access to you. So let's move to takeaway 2. When the apology never comes. And this is where I want to get really practical, because I think one of the most underserved conversations in trauma healing is what you actually do when the person who hurt you never takes accountability. You can't wait for external repair as a precondition for internal healing. That is not because the apology doesn't matter. It matters enormously. A genuine apology is a super powerful thing. It can really shift something like nothing else, but only if done right. Because if you make your healing contingent on receiving it, you hand the keys to your own recovery, I think, to someone who has already demonstrated that they are not trustworthy with those keys. So what do you do instead? And I think first you have to grieve what didn't happen. Not just the original harm that was done, but the response you needed and you didn't get. The accountability that never came, like the relationship with your family of origin that you thought you had. And then you discovered you didn't have that. I mean, the version of the story where the people who loved you showed up, and that grief is real and it deserves space, and skipping it in favor of forgiveness is one of the reasons forgiveness often does not stick. And secondly, separate their story from your truth. So people who cannot apologize, who align with perpetrators, who minimize harm to preserve their own comfort, they are operating from their own very defended internal world. It's shaky ground, folks, and their inability to show up for you is a statement about them, about their capacity, their self-worth, their own unprocessed wounds. It is not a statement about whether you deserved to be shown up for, because you did. The fact that they couldn't do it does not mean you weren't worth it. And that, to me, when I worked on that with my therapist, damn, something cracked open. So third, okay, after grieving what didn't happen and separating their story from your truth, find the witness. So trauma happens in isolation, in silence, without witnesses who say what happened to you was real and wrong and not okay. That kind of trauma has a harder time healing. Part of the injury in situations like this, the one that I described from our family, is that the people who should have witnessed and validated the harm instead denied it or minimized it. So you have to find other witnesses, a therapist, a community, people who can hold the truth of what happened with you without flinching. And that is not a small thing. And this is, I think, all part of the repair. And fourth, let yourself stay angry when you need to. So going back to everything we talked about in the anger series, the anger at not getting the apology you deserved is legitimate anger. It is pointing to something real, and processing it is part of what eventually creates the space where some measure of peace becomes possible. Not by suppressing it, but by moving it through. And I think this is how we actually heal and get unstuck. And finally, number 5, accept the reality of who they are. And this one is so painful, but it is also so liberating. Accepting that the person who harmed you is someone who cannot or will not take accountability. accepting that the family members who didn't show up may never be able to show up in the way you needed. Not because it's okay, but because accepting the reality of who someone is rather than continuing to grieve who you needed them to be is what eventually allows you to stop waiting for something that's not coming. And that acceptance is not forgiveness, but it's a kind of peace, maybe, if one could use that word in a painful situation. And it is available to you, though, without ever receiving that apology. And last but not least, takeaway 3, forgiving yourself. I have to be honest with you. This is the hardest one for me personally. And clinically, it is the piece that I see most often go unaddressed in trauma survivors who are doing everything else right. When someone we love is harmed, especially when that someone is a child, there is almost a layer of self-blame underneath the anger. A voice that says, I should have seen it coming. I should have protected him. I should have known. I should have done something differently. And that voice can be relentless, especially for those of us with complex trauma histories who already carry this very overdeveloped sense of responsibility for everything that happens around us, who were already primed probably by our early attachment experiences to believe that if something goes wrong, then it's somehow our fault. And forgiving yourself for not being able to prevent something you could have never predicted, for trusting people who appeared trustworthy, for being human in a situation that required you to be something more than human, is, I think, some of the most tender and most important forgiveness work there is out there. And it's nonviolence to the self, right? And it's where the work that happens entirely independently of anything the person who caused the harm does or doesn't do, like, has nothing to do with them. It doesn't require their apology. It doesn't require their acknowledgement. And it certainly doesn't require anything from anyone outside of you and the people who are safely holding your healing with you. What it does require, I think, is a willingness to extend to yourself that same compassion that you would extend to a client, a friend, a stranger who told you the story, to see yourself with the same humanity you see others with. To say that I did the best I could with what I knew and what I had, and that has to be enough, because it is all any of us ever have. And I'm still working on this, and I want to be honest about that some days I do it better than others. But I know that the self-forgiveness work is not optional. Like, it has to be the ground in which everything else is built on. So here is what I want you to carry from today. Number 1, forgiving and reconciling are not the same thing. You can do one without the other. Internal peace does not require reopening a door to someone who hasn't demonstrated that they deserve access to you. Number 2, when the apology never comes, the healing work shifts inward. Grieve what didn't happen. Separate their story from your truth. Find your witness. Let yourself be angry and accept it, as painful as this is, that this is the reality of who they are. And number 3, forgiving yourself is often the hardest and most important forgiveness work of all. It requires nothing from anyone who hurt you, and it is available to you right now, regardless of what they have or haven't done. So, that is all I have for today. On Wednesday, we are going to finish the forgiveness series with something really practical. So, what a real apology actually looks like, what makes it real versus what makes it a non-apology in disguise, and how to apologize well yourself, especially when you grew up in a family that never modeled it correctly. And I'm going to share something personal about my own experience of apologizing after the anger spilled out on our anniversary trip, because I think it's important to name that even those of us who teach this material, we get it wrong sometimes. Okay, a lot. And what we do after we get it wrong matters. So if today brought something up for you, please be gentle with yourself, because this is not easy material and you do not have to process it alone. And this is the last week that I'm taking those listener questions for the 2-part Ask Me Anything episode coming up on complex PTSD. So all of my contact info is in the show notes. Please rate, review this podcast wherever you listen. It helps so much. Until Wednesday, take good care of yourself.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.